The rain drummed against the windshield as Johnson pulled his 20-year-old Civic into the parking lot of Arlington National Cemetery. The wipers struggled against the downpour, creating streaks across the glass that blurred his view of the sacred grounds beyond. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel with hands that had once been steady enough to defuse improvised explosive devices in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now they trembled slightly, not from fear or excitement, but from something deeper, a cocktail of grief, determination, and the weight of memories that never seemed to fade. Had driven 4 hours from his small apartment in Richmond, Virginia, to attend the funeral of General Hawkins, a woman he had never met personally, but whose reputation had preceded her throughout his military career. General Hawkins had been a pioneer, one of the first women to achieve such high rank in the Army, and her passing had drawn military personnel from across the country. The funeral was being held at the Old Post Chapel, a venue that could accommodate the hundreds of mourners expected to pay their respects. As he stepped out of his car, adjusted his dress blues, the only formal military attire he still owned. The uniform felt strange now, looser in some places, and in others than it had during his active duty days 3 years ago. The fabric had faded slightly from its original deep blue, and there were small signs of wear that spoke to the financial realities of his post-military life. He had considered buying a new dress uniform for the occasion, but the cost would have meant choosing between rent and respect, and rent had won that particular battle. The rain soaked through his service cap within seconds, but didn't hurry toward the chapel entrance. He needed these few moments to prepare himself for what lay ahead. Funerals were difficult enough, but military funerals carried an additional weight of ceremony and expectation. There would be protocols to follow, hierarchies to respect, and an unspoken code of conduct that had been drilled into him during his 8 years of service. Had enlisted straight out of high school, drawn by a combination of patriotic duty and practical necessity. His family had been working class, and college seemed like a distant dream rather than an immediate possibility. The Army had promised training, education benefits, and a chance to serve something larger than himself. He had taken those promises seriously, throwing himself into his duties with the dedication that had eventually earned him the rank of staff sergeant and a position with an elite explosive ordnance disposal unit. His time in Afghanistan had been marked by countless missions that blended routine patrols with moments of heart-stopping intensity, had disarmed roadside bombs, cleared building compounds, and saved lives in ways both dramatic and mundane. He had earned commendations for his service, including a Bronze Star for actions during a particularly challenging deployment where his quick thinking had prevented casualties among his unit and local civilians. But military service, had learned, was as much about the quiet moments as the dramatic ones. It was about showing up every day, following orders, maintaining equipment, and being part of something that functioned because everyone understood their role and executed it properly. It was about respect, respect for the mission, respect for fellow service members, and respect for the traditions that connected current soldiers to generations of those who had served before them. When his enlistment ended, had faced the same difficult transition that challenged many veterans. The civilian world operated by different rules, with different priorities and different measures of success. The skills that had made him exceptional in the military, attention to detail, ability to work under pressure, leadership in crisis situations, didn't always translate directly to civilian employment opportunities. He had found work as a security guard at a shopping mall, a job that provided steady income but little in the way of purpose or advancement. The work was routine and often boring, a far cry from the intensity and importance of his military duties. But it paid the bills and gave him time to figure out his next steps, perhaps returning to school using his GI Bill benefits or finding a career path that could make use of his experience and training. Despite the challenges of transition, had maintained his connection to military culture and values. He participated in veterans organizations when he could afford it, stayed in touch with former unit members, and made an effort to attend significant military events. General Hawkins' funeral represented exactly the kind of occasion where presence mattered, where showing up was a way of honoring not just the deceased, but the larger community of service members past and present. As he finally began walking toward the chapel, noticed the other attendees arriving despite the rain. There were active duty personnel in crisp uniforms, retired officers whose bearing still spoke of military discipline, and families whose connection to the military was evident in their careful attention to appropriate attire and behavior. The parking area was a mixture of government vehicles, personal cars of varying ages and conditions, and a few luxury vehicles that suggested some attendees had found considerable success in their post-military careers. The chapel itself was a beautiful example of military architecture, built in a style that conveyed both dignity and strength. Its brick construction and simple but elegant design reflected the practical sensibility that characterized military installations, while its location within Arlington National Cemetery connected it to the broader narrative of American military service and sacrifice. Joined the flow of people moving toward the entrance, nodding the easy camaraderie among many of the attendees. Military funerals had a way of bringing together people who might not have seen each other in years, creating moments of reunion amid the sadness of loss. He recognized a few faces from his own service, though no one from his immediate unit, and exchanged nods of acknowledgement with several people whose uniforms or bearing marked them as fellow veterans. At the entrance to the chapel, a small receiving line had formed where immediate family members were greeting mourners. Waited patiently, watching as people ahead of him offered condolences and brief conversations with General Hawkins' widow and adult children. When his turn came, he shook hands and offered his respects, introducing himself as someone who had served during the same period as the general and had come to honor her memory and service. The interior of the chapel was already nearly full, with attendees representing every branch of service and spanning decades of military history. The front rows were reserved for family and high-ranking officials, while the middle sections filled with active duty personnel and retirees. Found a seat toward the back, recognizing that his current status as a lower-ranking veteran made such positioning both appropriate and expected. From his position, he could see the honor guard preparing for the ceremony, their movements precise and practiced. The casket, draped in an American flag, sat at the front of the chapel surrounded by floral arrangements that spoke to the respect and affection General Hawkins had earned throughout her career. Military funerals followed established protocols and found comfort in the familiar rhythms of ceremony and tradition. As the service began, listened to speakers who painted a picture of General Hawkins as not just a skilled military leader, but as a mentor, advocate, and pioneer who had opened doors for others while maintaining the highest standards of professional excellence. Her career had spanned multiple conflicts and institutional changes, and she had navigated challenges with grace and determination that had earned respect across all ranks and branches of service. The eulogy spoke to themes that resonated deeply with duty, honor, commitment, and the importance of service to something greater than oneself. These were the values that had drawn him to military service, and that continued to shape his understanding of proper conduct and personal responsibility. Hearing them articulated in the context of General Hawkins' remarkable career reminded him of the pride he felt in his own service and the standards he tried to maintain in his civilian life. When the formal service concluded, the attendees prepared to move outside for the graveside ceremony. This portion of military funerals carried particular solemnity, with the burial taking place among the white headstones that marked the resting places of hundreds of thousands of service members. The rain had lightened to a steady drizzle and pulled on his service cap as he joined the procession moving toward the burial site. The graveside area had been carefully prepared, with chairs for immediate family and designated standing areas for other attendees. Positioned himself with other veterans, maintaining proper distance while ensuring he could observe the ceremony appropriately. The honor guard moved with practiced precision, their actions coordinated through countless repetitions of these solemn duties. As the ceremony continued, found himself thinking not just about General Hawkins, but about the broader community of service members gathered to honor her memory. Despite differences in rank, branch of service, and time of duty, there was a shared understanding among everyone present about the significance of the moment and the importance of showing proper respect. The rifle volley, when it came, echoed across the cemetery with the sharp precision that military ceremonies demanded. Stood at attention, his training taking over as the familiar sounds and sights of military honor surrounded him. The folding and presentation of the flag to General Hawkins' widow carried emotional weight that transcended individual relationships, representing the gratitude of a nation for distinguished service. As the ceremony concluded, attendees began to disperse slowly, many stopping to speak with family members or reconnect with fellow veterans. Waited respectfully before approaching the family area to offer final condolences. The widow, despite her grief, took time to thank him for attending and to ask about his own service. Such personal attention from someone dealing with profound loss reminded of the grace and strength that military families developed through years of deployments, separations, and the constant awareness of service-related risks. Walking back toward his car, reflected on the afternoon's events and what they meant to him personally. Military funerals served multiple purposes, honoring the deceased, comforting the family, and reinforcing the bonds that connected service members across time and circumstance. They were reminders of shared values and common commitment that transcended individual differences and circumstances. The drive home would give him time to process the emotions and thoughts that such occasions inevitably stirred. Military service created connections that lasted long beyond active duty, and participating in ceremonies like General Hawkins' funeral was one way of maintaining those connections and honoring the principles that had shaped his understanding of duty and service. As he reached his car, noticed that the rain had finally stopped and breaks in the clouds were allowing afternoon sunlight to filter through. The weather seemed appropriate somehow, suggesting that even in times of loss and sadness, there were reasons for hope and continuance. General Hawkins' legacy would continue through the people she had influenced, the barriers she had broken, and the standards she had set for others to follow. Starting his engine, prepared for the journey back to Richmond, carrying with him the memories of a ceremony that had reinforced his connection to military values and community. The afternoon had been about honoring a distinguished officer, but it had also been about remembering what service meant and why such traditions mattered. These were lessons he would carry forward, regardless of what challenges or opportunities lay ahead in his civilian life. The reception following General Hawkins' funeral was being held at the Officers' Club on Fort, adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery. Had initially planned to drive straight home after the burial ceremony, but several veterans he had spoken with encouraged him to attend. The reception would provide an opportunity for more personal conversations and stories about the general's life and career, they explained, and these gatherings often meant as much to attendees as the formal ceremonies themselves. Hesitated before entering the club building. Officers' clubs were traditionally spaces for commissioned personnel, and while receptions like this one welcomed all service members, he felt somewhat out of place. His enlisted background and current civilian status made him acutely aware of the social dynamics that operated within military communities, even during somber occasions like funeral receptions. The club's main reception room had been arranged with round tables that could accommodate 8 to 10 people each, along with a buffet area and a small stage where speakers would share additional memories of General Hawkins. The atmosphere was more relaxed than the formal funeral service, allowing for the kind of personal interactions that helped process grief and celebrate a life well lived. Accepted a cup of coffee from the service staff and found a position near the back of the room where he could observe without drawing attention to himself. The attendees represented a cross-section of military hierarchy and civilian supporters, from junior enlisted personnel to general officers, along with family members and friends whose connections to General Hawkins spanned her entire career. At a table near the front of the room, noticed several officers whose uniform decorations and bearing marked them as senior leadership. Among them was a man whose posture and the respectful attention he received from others suggested significant rank and influence. Later learned this was General Robert, a 4-star general whose career had intersected with General Hawkins' service in multiple theaters and assignments. General had a reputation that preceded him throughout the military community. Known for his tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to taking care of soldiers, he had led forces in some of the most challenging operations of the past 2 decades. Stories about his leadership style emphasized his hands-on approach and his insistence on knowing the soldiers under his command as individuals rather than simply as numbers on unit rosters. During his active duty service, had heard numerous accounts of General's leadership philosophy. The general was known for visiting forward operating bases unannounced, eating meals with enlisted personnel, and taking time to listen to concerns from soldiers at every level of the chain of command. Such behavior was unusual among officers of his rank, who typically remained focused on strategic and policy-level responsibilities rather than individual soldier welfare. As the reception continued, speakers began sharing stories that painted a more personal picture of General Hawkins than the formal eulogies had provided. Colleagues spoke about her sense of humor, her mentoring relationships with junior officers, and her ability to maintain perspective during the most stressful periods of military operations. These stories humanized her accomplishments and reminded attendees that behind every distinguished military career were countless personal interactions and relationships that shaped both the officer and those they served alongside. Found himself particularly moved by stories about General Hawkins' commitment to supporting enlisted personnel and their families. Several speakers described instances where she had gone beyond normal command responsibilities to ensure that soldiers and their dependents received necessary support during deployments, family emergencies, or transition periods. Such actions reflected a leadership philosophy that understood military effectiveness as dependent on taking care of people, not just managing resources and operations. One retired sergeant major shared a story about how General Hawkins had personally intervened when his family faced housing difficulties during a permanent change of station move. Rather than referring the matter to subordinate staff, she had made phone calls herself and followed up to ensure the problem was resolved quickly and completely. The sergeant major's voice carried emotion as he described how that intervention had affected not just his family's immediate situation, but his entire perception of what leadership could and should look like. Another speaker, a lieutenant colonel who had served as one of General Hawkins' staff officers, described her approach to decision-making and problem-solving. The general, she explained, insisted on understanding issues from multiple perspectives before making decisions, and she was particularly careful to seek input from enlisted personnel who would be most directly affected by policy changes or operational directives. This approach sometimes slowed decision-making processes, but it resulted in better outcomes and stronger support from those responsible for implementation. As listened to these stories, he reflected on his own experiences with military leadership during his 8 years of service. He had encountered officers whose leadership styles ranged from inspiring to disappointing, and he had developed strong opinions about what constituted effective command presence and decision-making. The stories about General Hawkins resonated with his understanding of leadership as service to others rather than simply exercise of authority. During a break between speakers, noticed commotion near the entrance to the reception room. A young man in civilian clothes was speaking animatedly with someone who appeared to be event staff, and their conversation was attracting attention from nearby attendees. The young man's body language suggested frustration or disagreement, and could see that the situation was beginning to create distraction from the reception's purpose. Moving closer to observe, overheard fragments of conversation that suggested the young man was being entry to the reception. The staff member was explaining politely, but firmly, that the event was limited to military personnel, family members, and specifically invited guests. The young man was insisting that he had a right to attend, that his service record entitled him to participate in honoring General Hawkins' memory. Could see that the young man was becoming increasingly agitated, and his voice was beginning to carry across the reception room in a way that was disrupting other conversations. Several attendees had turned to watch the interaction and sensed that the situation needed resolution before it escalated further and detracted from the dignity of the occasion. The young man appeared to be in his late 20s, with short hair and bearing that suggested military background despite his civilian attire. His clothes were clean but clearly inexpensive, and he carried himself with the slight tension that recognized as common among recent veterans who were still adjusting to civilian life. There was something familiar about his situation that reminded of his own struggles with transition and finding his place in post-military social situations. As the conversation continued, learned that the young man's name was David, and he claimed to have served in the Army before transitioning to civilian life. The staff member was explaining that while his service was appreciated, the reception required either active duty status, family connection, or specific invitation, none of which David appeared to possess. The explanation was delivered professionally, but without flexibility, and could see that David interpreted it as rejection rather than adherence to established protocols. David's frustration was becoming more evident as he struggled to articulate why his attendance mattered to him personally. He spoke about General Hawkins' reputation and his respect for her service, and he mentioned his own military background as justification for inclusion. but his arguments lacked the specific connections or credentials that would satisfy the staff members' requirements, and could see that the situation was heading toward either David's removal or continued disruption of the reception. The interaction highlighted some of the challenges that veterans faced when trying to maintain connections to military communities after their active duty service ended. Formal events often had requirements that excluded people whose service records or current status didn't meet specific criteria, even when their desire to participate came from genuine respect and appropriate motivations. Understood both perspectives in the conflict. Event organizers had legitimate reasons for controlling attendance, particularly for receptions that followed solemn ceremonies like military funerals. But he also recognized David's frustration at being excluded from an opportunity to honor someone whose service he admired, particularly when that exclusion seemed to be based on bureaucratic requirements rather than lack of appropriate respect or motivation. The situation was beginning to attract more attention from reception attendees, including some of the senior officers who had been sharing stories about General Hawkins. Could see that intervention would be necessary soon, either to resolve the matter quietly or to remove David from the premises before his presence became a larger disruption. As watched, he noticed that General had become aware of the commotion and was observing the interaction with interest. The four-star general's attention to the situation suggested that it might be resolved at a higher level than the staff member who had been handling it initially. Knew enough about military hierarchy to understand that general officers typically preferred to avoid direct involvement in minor administrative matters, but they also understood when situations required command attention. General's reputation for caring about individual soldiers made wonder how he would handle David's situation. Stories about the general suggested he might be more inclined than other senior officers to look beyond strict protocol requirements when genuine respect and appropriate motivation were evident. But funeral receptions also carried special significance that required careful attention to dignity and proper order. David continued to plead his case, his voice carrying increasing desperation as he realized that his initial arguments weren't succeeding. He began sharing more details about his military service, mentioning deployments and unit assignments that recognized as legitimate and honorable. But personal service record, while worthy of respect, wasn't necessarily sufficient justification for attendance at events with specific invitation requirements. The staff member remained polite but firm, acknowledging David's service while maintaining that reception attendance required credentials he didn't possess. The conversation was reaching an impasse that would likely result in security intervention if some form of resolution wasn't reached soon. Could see that David was becoming more emotional as his options narrowed, and he recognized the signs of someone whose pride and sense of belonging were being challenged. As the situation continued to develop, found himself thinking about his own experience navigating post-military social situations. The transition from active duty to civilian life involved learning new rules and expectations, and veterans often struggled with situations where their military identity and accomplishments didn't automatically provide access or acceptance. The reception continued around the developing conflict, with most attendees trying to focus on the stories and conversations that honored General Hawkins' memory, but could sense the growing awareness of the situation and the potential for it to overshadow the event's primary purpose. Something would need to happen soon to resolve the matter and restore appropriate focus to the reception's commemorative goals. Watched as the tension between David and the club staff member continued to escalate. David's voice had risen enough that conversations at nearby tables were pausing, and could see other attendees beginning to take notice of the disturbance. The young veteran's face showed a mixture of frustration and embarrassment as he realized his situation was becoming a public spectacle rather than a private matter. The staff member, a middle-aged woman whose professional demeanor suggested years of experience managing difficult situations, maintained her composure while firmly explaining the reception's attendance requirements. She acknowledged David's military service and expressed appreciation for his desire to honor General Hawkins, but she could not make exceptions to established protocols without proper authorization from event organizers. Found himself torn between his instinct to respect established procedures and his sympathy for David's obvious distress. The young man's civilian clothes and earnest manner reminded of his own struggles with finding his place in military-connected events after his discharge. There was something particularly painful about being excluded from opportunities to honor fallen service members, especially when that exclusion seemed to be based on administrative technicalities rather than lack of genuine respect. As David continued to plead his case, noticed that his military bearing became more pronounced under stress. Despite his civilian attire, his posture and speech patterns reflected training and discipline that were unmistakably military in origin. He spoke about his deployment to Iraq, his service with a combat engineer unit, and his respect for senior officers like General Hawkins, who had broken barriers and set examples for others to follow. The details of David's service sounded authentic too, who had developed an ability to distinguish between genuine veterans and those who might exaggerate or fabricate military experience. David mentioned specific locations, unit designations, and types of missions that matched own knowledge of recent military operations. His frustration seemed to stem from genuine disappointment at being excluded rather than from any sense of entitlement or inappropriate behavior. General had continued to observe the situation from his table near the front of the room, and could see that the four-star general was paying close attention to both the conversation and David's demeanor. His reputation for personal involvement in soldier welfare suggested he might intervene, but funeral receptions required careful attention to dignity and protocol that could limit even a senior general's flexibility. The club's management had apparently decided that the situation required additional authority, because noticed a man in a business suit approaching the entrance area. The man's bearing and the respectful attention he received from staff members suggested he was either club management or event security. His involvement indicated that David's continued presence was being viewed as a potential problem that needed resolution. David noticed the approaching official and seemed to realize that his opportunity to gain entrance was diminishing rapidly. His voice took on a more desperate quality as he tried to explain why attending the reception mattered to him personally. He spoke about General Hawkins as a role model whose career had inspired his own service, and he mentioned his current struggles with civilian employment and maintaining connections to military community. The approaching official introduced himself as the club manager and asked to speak with David privately about the situation. His tone was professional but firm, suggesting that private conversation was preferable to continued public discussion, but that the outcome would likely be David's departure from the premises. Felt compelled to act. Something about David's situation resonated with his own experience and values, and he couldn't simply stand by while a fellow veteran was excluded from an opportunity to pay respects to a distinguished officer. He approached the group at the entrance, identifying himself as a veteran who had attended the funeral and reception. Speaking directly to the club manager, vouched for David's character and motivation based on their brief interaction. He explained that David appeared to be a genuine veteran whose desire to attend came from appropriate respect rather than any intention to cause disruption. Suggested that temporary accommodation might be possible given the special circumstances of honoring General Hawkins' service. The club manager listened politely, but explained that reception attendance required either active duty status, family relationship, or specific invitation, none of which David possessed. Making exceptions, even for worthy individuals, could set precedents that would complicate future event management. The explanation was reasonable from an administrative perspective, but it offered no solution to David's immediate situation. David looked at with gratitude for the intervention while maintaining his composure despite obvious disappointment. He thanked for speaking on his behalf and began to acknowledge that he would need to leave. The resignation in his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to disappointment and exclusion, and recognized the particular pain of being shut out from military community events. Before David could complete his departure, a voice cut through the conversation with unmistakable authority. "What seems to be the problem here?" The question came from General, who had left his table to investigate the commotion personally. His four-star rank insignia and command presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the entire situation. The club manager quickly explained the situation to General, emphasizing adherence to established protocols while acknowledging David's apparent veteran status and appropriate motivation for wanting to attend. The manager's tone remained professional, but took on additional deference in addressing the senior general. General looked directly at David, studying him with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel quickly and accurately. "Son, "Tell me about your service," he said, his voice carrying both authority and genuine interest in David's response. David straightened unconsciously as he answered, his military training taking over despite his civilian status. He provided a concise summary of his service record, including his unit assignment, deployment location, duration of service, and discharge status. His delivery was factual and humble, without exaggeration or self-promotion, and could see that General was evaluating both the content and manner of David's response. General asked several follow-up questions that demonstrated his familiarity with military operations and his ability to verify the accuracy of David's claims. David answered each question clearly and specifically, providing details that would be difficult to fabricate, and that confirmed his legitimate military background. The general then asked David why attending the reception was important to him, and the young veteran's answer revealed deeper motivations than simple desire for inclusion. David spoke about his struggles with civilian transition, his efforts to maintain connection to military values and community, and his particular respect for General Hawkins as an example of leadership that transcended traditional barriers. David explained that General Hawkins' career had inspired his own commitment to service excellence despite facing discrimination and challenges. As an Asian American soldier, he had encountered prejudice and assumptions about his capabilities, and General Hawkins' example of succeeding despite similar obstacles had motivated him to persist through difficult periods of his military service. His current civilian struggles included unemployment, difficulty translating military skills to civilian job requirements, and social isolation from the military community that had provided structure and purpose during his active duty years. Attending events like the reception represented one of the few remaining connections to the values and relationships that had defined his adult identity. General listened to David's explanation without interruption, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts or intentions. When David finished, the general asked about his discharge status and current employment situation. David admitted that he had been unemployed for several months and was living in a veteran's transitional housing facility while searching for permanent employment. The club manager and event staff waited respectfully for General's decision, understanding that his rank and reputation gave him authority to override normal protocols if he chose to do so. Watched the interaction with fascination, recognizing that he was witnessing the kind of leadership moment that defined military culture at its best. After a long pause, General turned to the club manager. "This young man is my guest," he said simply. "Please see that he receives appropriate hospitality." The statement was delivered as a command rather than a request, and its implications were immediately clear to everyone present. The club manager nodded acknowledgement and immediately began arranging for David's accommodation at the reception. The transformation in staff behavior was immediate and complete, reflecting the absolute authority that General's rank and decision carried in military settings. David looked stunned by the sudden reversal of his situation, struggling to process the change from exclusion to personal invitation by one of the Army's most senior officers. He began to thank General, but the General interrupted with a gesture. "No thanks necessary, son," General said. "General Hawkins would have wanted you here. She understood what it meant to serve despite obstacles, and she would have appreciated your desire to honor her memory." The General's words carried weight beyond simple courtesy, suggesting deeper understanding of the challenges that David had described. General then turned to, acknowledging his intervention on David's behalf. "Thank you for speaking up," he said. "Looking out for fellow veterans is exactly the kind of behavior that General Hawkins valued. Both of you honor her memory by being here today." With that, General returned to his table, leaving David and at the entrance with their situations completely transformed. The club staff immediately began treating both men with the deference appropriate to personal guests of a four-star general, and their access to all reception activities was no longer in question. David struggled to compose himself as the reality of his changed circumstances sank in. From near exclusion to personal guest status in a matter of minutes represented the kind of dramatic reversal that military hierarchies could create when senior leadership chose to intervene personally. Felt both relief and admiration for General handling of the situation. The General had evaluated the circumstances quickly, made a decision based on principles rather than protocols, and used his authority to ensure that worthy individuals could participate in honoring a distinguished officer's memory. As they entered the main reception area together, and David found themselves connected by the shared experience of general's intervention. The incident had demonstrated the power of senior leadership to override bureaucratic barriers when human dignity and appropriate values were at stake. The transformation in David's demeanor was immediate and profound. From the dejected young man who had been facing exclusion from the reception, he had become the personal guest of General, one of the Army's most respected senior leaders. As David and entered the main reception area together, David moved with careful attention to proper behavior, clearly understanding the significance of the opportunity he had been given. Guided David toward the coffee service, knowing that having something to do with his hands would help the younger veteran manage his obvious nervousness. David's gratitude was evident in his every gesture and word, but could also see that he was struggling to process the dramatic change in his circumstances. Being personally vouched for by a four-star general was an honor that few service members of any rank ever experienced. As they stood together near the refreshment area, David shared more details about his background and current situation. He had grown up in a working-class family in California, where his parents had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s, seeking better opportunities for their children. Military service had represented both patriotic duty and practical advancement, providing training, education benefits, and a chance to prove his commitment to his adopted country. David's military service had been marked by solid performance and steady advancement through the enlisted ranks. He had deployed to Iraq as a combat engineer, where his unit had been responsible for route clearance operations and infrastructure repair in some of the most dangerous areas of operations. His work had involved detecting and neutralizing improvised explosive devices, clearing damaged roads and bridges, and supporting convoy operations that kept supply lines functioning despite constant threats. The technical skills David had learned during his military service were substantial and valuable. He had trained on sophisticated detection equipment, demolition techniques, construction machinery, and project management systems that should have translated well to civilian employment opportunities. His security clearance, leadership experience, and proven ability to work under pressure represented exactly the kind of qualifications that many employers claim to value in veteran candidates. However, David's transition to civilian employment had proven far more difficult than expected. Despite his technical qualifications and security clearance, he had encountered repeated rejections from potential employers. Some seemed to view his military experience as irrelevant to civilian operations, while others appeared concerned about potential psychological effects of combat service. The gap between employer rhetoric about supporting veterans and actual hearing practices had become frustratingly apparent. David's current living situation reflected the economic realities of extended unemployment. The veterans' transitional housing facility provided basic accommodation while he searched for permanent employment, but it was designed as temporary support rather than long-term housing. The facility's rules and time limitations created additional pressure to find employment quickly, even if that meant accepting positions that didn't make full use of his skills and training. As David shared his story, recognized many familiar elements from his own post-military experience and that of other veterans he had known. The transition from military to civilian employment often proved more challenging than expected, despite the valuable skills and experience that military service provided. The structured environment and clear expectations of military life contrasted sharply with the ambiguity and informal networks that often determined civilian career success. Had been fortunate to find steady employment as a security guard, even though the work didn't fully utilize his military training and experience. Many veterans faced longer periods of unemployment or underemployment as they navigated the differences between military and civilian workplace cultures. The challenges were particularly acute for combat veterans whose specialized skills didn't have obvious civilian equivalents. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of an older gentleman whose military bearing and confident manner suggested senior rank despite his civilian attire. He introduced himself as Colonel James, retired, and explained that he had overheard portions of their conversation. Colonel was currently working as a civilian contractor supporting military engineering projects, and David's background had caught his attention. Colonel asked David about his specific technical training and experience, probing for details about equipment operation, project management, and security clearance status. David responded with the same straightforward professionalism he had shown with General, providing accurate information without exaggeration or false modesty. The colonel explained that his current employer was actively seeking qualified personnel for engineering support contracts with the Department of Defense. David's combination of technical skills, security clearance, and military experience matched exactly the qualifications they needed for several open positions. The work would involve supporting infrastructure projects on military installations, providing exactly the kind of environment where David's background would be valued rather than viewed as a liability. Colonel provided David with his business card and encouraged him to submit an application through the company's website. He offered to serve as a reference and to ensure that David's application received appropriate attention from hearing managers. The colonel emphasized that the company actively recruited veterans and understood the value of military training and experience. David accepted the business card with obvious gratitude and excitement, understanding that this unexpected contact could represent the employment breakthrough he had been seeking. The irony was not lost on either David or that attending General Hawkins' funeral reception, which had initially seemed impossible, was providing exactly the kind of professional networking opportunity that could change David's entire situation. As Colonel returned to his table, David, and reflected on the rapid series of events that had transformed the afternoon from potential disappointment to unexpected opportunity. General's intervention had not only allowed David to honor General Hawkins' memory, but had created the circumstances for a potentially life-changing professional connection. Their conversation was again interrupted, this time by General himself, who approached their position with a plate of food and an invitation for them to join his table. The four-star general's personal attention continued to demonstrate his commitment to the principles of leadership and soldier care that had defined his career. At General's table, David found themselves in conversation with some of the most senior and accomplished military leaders present at the reception. The discussion ranged from memories of General Hawkins to broader topics about military service, veteran transition challenges, and the importance of maintaining connections between active duty and veteran communities. General asked David about his specific employment challenges and listened carefully to his responses. The general's questions revealed deep understanding of the systemic issues that affected veteran employment, from civilian employer misconceptions about military service to the practical difficulties of translating military skills to civilian job requirements. The general shared his own observations about the disconnect between civilian employer rhetoric and actual hearing practices regarding veterans. While many companies publicly expressed support for veteran employment, their actual practices often reflected unconscious biases or lack of understanding about military training and experience. General had been personally involved in several initiatives aimed at improving veteran employment outcomes through better employer education and veteran preparation programs. General then surprised both David and by asking for their contact information. He explained that he maintained informal networks aimed at supporting veteran employment and transition success, and he believed both men could benefit from those connections. The general's offer of personal support went far beyond the normal expectations of military hierarchy and demonstrated his genuine commitment to veteran welfare. David struggled to maintain his composure as he provided his contact information to General. The prospect of having a four-star general's personal support in his employment search represented an opportunity that few people ever received, regardless of their qualifications or circumstances. Also provided his information, though he was less certain about what General might be able to offer given his current stable employment. The general explained that veteran support involved more than just individual assistance. It required building networks and communities that could sustain long-term success for all participants. As the reception continued, David found themselves welcomed into conversations with people they would never have expected to meet under normal circumstances. Their association with General had opened doors and created opportunities for dialogue with senior leaders from multiple branches of service and defense industry representatives. The afternoon's events had demonstrated the power of military networks and the importance of senior leadership commitment to taking care of soldiers and veterans. General's intervention had transformed what began as an exclusion into an opportunity that could change David's entire future trajectory. As the reception began to wind down, David approached General to express his gratitude for the General's support and intervention. General's response emphasized that supporting fellow service members was not a favor but a fundamental responsibility that came with military service and continued throughout civilian life. The general reminded David that General Hawkins' legacy included her commitment to breaking down barriers and creating opportunities for others to succeed. By supporting David's professional advancement, General was continuing that tradition of leadership and mentorship that connected current and former service members across generations. General also emphasized to both David and that accepting support carried the responsibility to provide similar assistance to other veterans when opportunities arose. Military values of service and commitment extended beyond individual advancement to include building stronger communities and support systems for all who had served. As David and prepared to leave the reception, they exchanged contact information and committed to staying in touch about their respective situations and opportunities. The shared experience of the afternoon had created a connection that transcended their different circumstances and backgrounds. 3 weeks after General Hawkins' funeral reception, David sat in a conference room at Engineering Solutions, wearing his best interview suit and trying to calm his nerves before meeting with the hearing manager. Colonel had been true to his word, ensuring that David's application received immediate attention and that his interview was scheduled promptly. The company specialized in infrastructure support contracts for military installations, exactly the kind of work where David's background would be valued. The interview process had been unlike anything David had experienced during his months of job searching. Instead of skeptical questions about his military experience or concerns about his ability to adapt to civilian workplace culture, the hearing manager had focused on understanding his technical skills and leadership experience. The interviewer, herself a veteran, had asked specific questions about David's demolition training, project management experience, and security clearance status. When David explained his experience with route clearance operations in Iraq, including the technical challenges and safety requirements involved, the hearing manager had nodded with obvious understanding. She had served in a similar capacity during her own military career and immediately grasped the complexity and responsibility that David's duties had required. For the first time since beginning his job search, David felt that his military experience was being viewed as an asset rather than a potential liability. The job offer had come within a week of the interview, including a salary that exceeded David's expectations and benefits that would provide the stability he had been seeking since his discharge. The position would involve supporting infrastructure improvement projects at military installations throughout the region, work that would make direct use of his engineering training while allowing him to maintain connections to military communities. David's first day at Engineering Solutions had reinforced his positive impressions from the interview process. The company's workforce included numerous veterans from all branches of service, creating an environment where military experience and values were understood and appreciated. His immediate supervisor was a retired Army major who had served in similar capacities and who provided mentorship that helped David navigate the transition from unemployment to meaningful career employment. The work itself proved both challenging and satisfying in ways that David had not experienced since his military discharge. Projects involved complex technical requirements, tight deadlines, and coordination between multiple agencies and contractors. David's military training in working under pressure and maintaining attention to detail served him well in managing project timelines and quality standards that directly affected military readiness and safety. Within his first month at Engineering Solutions, David had been assigned to lead a team responsible for upgrading electrical systems at a nearby military installation. The project required coordination with base personnel, civilian contractors, and regulatory agencies while maintaining strict security and safety protocols. David's military background enabled him to communicate effectively with installation personnel and to understand operational requirements that civilian contractors might overlook. The success of David's initial projects had earned recognition from both his civilian supervisors and military personnel at the installations where he worked. His ability to bridge military and civilian perspectives while maintaining high standards of technical performance had made him valuable to project teams and led to increased responsibility and advancement opportunities. Johnson had followed David's progress through occasional text messages and phone calls that had grown into a genuine friendship based on their shared experience at General Hawkins' reception. Had watched with satisfaction as David's life transformed from unemployment and housing instability to career success and personal confidence. The change demonstrated the power of the military network that General had activated through his intervention. Had also benefited from his connection to General, though in less dramatic ways than David's career transformation. The General had introduced to veterans organizations that provided professional development opportunities and networking events. Through these connections, had learned about advancement opportunities within the security industry and had begun pursuing additional training that could lead to supervisory positions. More significantly, had become involved in veteran mentorship programs that allowed him to use his own experience to help other veterans navigate transition challenges. Working with recently discharged service members had given a sense of purpose that his security guard position, while necessary, had not provided. The mentorship work connected him to the values and sense of mission that had drawn him to military service originally. General had maintained periodic contact with both David and, checking on their progress and offering additional support when needed. The General's continued involvement demonstrated his genuine commitment to veteran welfare rather than simple ceremonial gestures. His approach to leadership extended far beyond his active duty responsibilities to include long-term investment in the success of people he encountered. 6 months after the funeral reception, General invited David to attend a veterans networking event that he was hosting at a hotel in Washington, D.C. The event would bring together veterans from various career fields with employers, educators, and service organizations committed to supporting veteran success. General explained that he wanted David to share their experiences as examples of how proper support and networking could transform veteran transition outcomes. At the networking event, David found himself speaking to a room full of veterans and civilian supporters about his journey from unemployment to career success. He emphasized the importance of General's intervention and the role that military networks could play in creating opportunities for veteran advancement. His presentation was well received and led to additional speaking opportunities at veteran transition workshops and employer education seminars. Spoke about his experience with mentorship programs and the satisfaction of helping other veterans avoid some of the challenges he had faced during his own transition. He emphasized that veteran support required ongoing commitment rather than one-time assistance, and he encouraged other successful veterans to become involved in mentorship and advocacy activities. General used the event to announce the launch of a formal veteran networking initiative that would connect successful veterans with those facing transition challenges. The program would provide structured mentorship, professional development opportunities, and employer partnerships designed to improve veteran employment outcomes. General had secured funding and organizational support for the initiative, demonstrating his commitment to systematic rather than individual solutions to veteran transition challenges. David had been selected to serve as one of the program's regional coordinators, a position that would allow him to combine his technical career with veteran advocacy work. The role would involve recruiting mentor volunteers, developing relationships with veteran-friendly employers, and providing direct support to veterans facing employment challenges. Had agreed to serve as a mentor within the program, using his experience and connections to help other veterans find meaningful employment and adjust to civilian workplace cultures. His background in security work and involvement with veterans organizations made him particularly valuable in working with veterans whose military specialties didn't have obvious civilian equivalents. The program's formal launch had attracted attention from military leadership, veteran service organizations, and employers committed to improving veteran hearing practices. General's reputation and personal involvement had provided credibility that enabled rapid expansion and institutional support for the initiative. 1 year after General Hawkins' funeral reception, David attended the first annual awards ceremony for the Veteran Networking Program. The event celebrated success stories from veterans who had benefited from the program's support, as well as recognizing employers and mentors who had contributed to positive outcomes. David had been promoted to Senior Project Manager at Engineering Solutions and had completed additional training that qualified him for increasingly complex infrastructure projects. His success had enabled him to move from transitional housing to his own apartment and to begin planning for long-term career advancement and personal goals. Had been promoted to Assistant Security Supervisor and was pursuing additional education using his GI Bill benefits. His involvement in veteran mentorship had connected him with opportunities for advancement within veterans' organizations and had provided leadership experience that enhanced his civilian career prospects. General had retired from active duty, but continued to lead the Veteran Networking Initiative as a civilian organization. His commitment to veteran welfare had evolved from individual interventions to systematic programs that could support thousands of veterans facing transition challenges. The awards ceremony included a special tribute to General Hawkins' legacy of breaking barriers and supporting others' advancement. General spoke about how her example had inspired his own commitment to veteran support and how the networking program honored her memory through practical assistance rather than ceremonial recognition alone. David and were recognized as examples of the program's success, but General emphasized that their achievements represented their own hard work and determination rather than simply the program's effectiveness. The General stressed that successful veteran transition required both individual effort and community support, and that programs like theirs were designed to enhance rather than replace personal responsibility and initiative. As the ceremony concluded, David reflected on the journey that had begun with his near exclusion from General Hawkins' funeral reception. The transformation from unemployment and housing instability to career success and community leadership had exceeded his most optimistic expectations when he had driven to Arlington National Cemetery that rainy afternoon. Thought about how his decision to speak up for David had led to his own involvement in veteran mentorship and advocacy work. The intervention that had seemed like simple courtesy had connected him to purpose and community that enhanced both his civilian career and personal satisfaction. General had demonstrated that leadership involved creating opportunities for others to succeed rather than simply exercising authority or receiving recognition. His commitment to veteran welfare had transformed individual lives while building systematic support that would benefit future generations of transitioning service members. The Veteran Networking Program continued to expand and had become a model for similar initiatives in other regions. The success demonstrated that military values of service and commitment could be applied effectively to civilian challenges, and that senior leadership engagement could create lasting positive change in veterans' lives. David's final reflection on the entire experience emphasized the importance of showing up and persisting despite obstacles and rejections. His determination to attend General Hawkins' reception had created the circumstances for everything that followed, demonstrating that small acts of courage and persistence could lead to transformational opportunities.